Welcome to the Math Ed Podcast. My name is Sam Otten from the University of Missouri, and with me today is a member of the National Academy of Education. He's a recipient of the Hans Freudenthal Medal, a recipient of the Silver Scribner Award from the American Educational Research Association, and he is now a professor emeritus of math education at Vanderbilt University. It is Paul Cobb. Paul, thanks so much for taking time today.
Great pleasure. Thank you for the invitation.
We are going to be doing a bit of a conversation through Paul's long and illustrious career. I like to, every once in a while, grab a senior scholar and try to see if we can trace the intellectual thread of their work and the sort of different eras of their research. And Paul, your work has been influential in the field for literally decades. And so I really appreciate this honor to talk to you about your work and get your perspective and your stories about how that all came together. I apologize that my voice is not in tip-top shape. I have a little bit of a cold, but that happens sometimes with 4 young kids at home. So I hope we can bear through it.
Sounds good.
So let's go ahead and start back at the beginning. But if we are tracing your research career, I'm just curious when and why you decided that maybe being a mathematics education researcher and a scholar was a career and a pathway that you wanted to take.
I'll tell you the true story. It's not very illustrious, that's for sure. And it's very simply, my wife and I got on a plane with 2 suitcases each to come to the States because I had been accepted into the master's program. And we were coming for 16 months. And why did we come? It was simply, I don't want to say a lark, but it was just an opportunity to go and live abroad for a while and visit the United States. We came for no other reason. I had absolutely no intention of staying. And what happened is I very quickly became very interested in what I was doing, in the work I was involved in at Georgia in the master's program. And so pretty early, I decided I wanted to stay on and do a doctorate. And it was just that happenstance experience.
And what kind of things were you investigating at that time that sort of piqued your interest and thought, oh, I want to keep at this?
That's a good question. I'm trying to cast my mind back. But what it was, I had been a high school teacher in England, so I hadn't taught below 9th grade, right? And here I am. I end up working with kids in 1st and 2nd grade. Why even that? It was Les Steffi's work and the work he was leading and directing. I can't remember the details because I wasn't actually an assistant for him or anything at that time. But I kind of picked up on that. And another student, somebody very well known in the field as well, Pat Thompson, was a doctoral student. And I asked him, and he gave me some papers that Les and somebody else, some of your listeners might know, Ernst von Glasersfeld, had written. And I found them fascinating. And it was because of more the theoretical work they were doing, the empirical grounding, actually doing the teaching experiments one-on-one with kids that really drew me in. You know, it just sucked me straight in. I ended up working with Les on his work in my entire time at Georgia, which was 5 years.
Yeah, so I was going to have you just share more about that graduate school experience. So it was at Georgia at that time. And what era was this, if you want to just
Okay, this is back in prehistory. I was there from 1978 to 83. So God help me, I graduated 40 years ago this past summer. I was thinking about my doctoral studies. Yeah, I took some classes and some good classes, but that's not what I remember or stuck with me at all. I was also very fortunate in work. Les Steffi at that time was working with 3 other people, Ernst von Glasersfeld, who was a psychologist and an epistemologist, and a guy called John Richards, who was a philosopher of mathematics. And they worked very collaboratively, and just being part of that sort of research team where there was that ongoing collaboration clearly has influenced me through my entire career. I have always endeavored to work in that way. And so I see great value in working with teams. The actual work, they had a project, it was called IRON, Interdisciplinary Research on Number. And I think it was quite innovative at that time. What Les was interested in was simply the development of young kids' thinking. And he wanted to see the actual moments, process of learning, hence the development of the teaching experiment methodology. And for example, the data on which my dissertation was based, it came out of a 2-year data collection effort where we taught 6 kids ourselves one-on-one twice a week for 2 years through their 1st grade year and their 2nd grade year. And we videoed each of those sessions. This was back in the early days of video. So the tape deck itself, I know, weighed 35 pounds. Then there was the camera, huge, great camera, black and white. And you ended up with kids in a snowstorm No, it was our data that we analyzed. So it was one of those very first video studies.
Wow.
And so I feel quite blessed, A, with the interdisciplinary nature of the work, and B, simply one of the first manifestations of teaching experience. We now probably say more a design experiment or something. So I had that grounding. And for me, working collaboratively in that manner was just, it became normal. And I've realized later how fortunate I was.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing I want to mention is Ernst von Glasersfeld, who was incredibly kind to me. So, for example, he invited me to join a faculty discussion group, I guess, and it was interdisciplinary across the university. And one faculty member would propose a paper, everybody read it, and then meet at somebody's house to discuss it. And so I got exposure to sort of ideas in philosophy of science, literacy criticism that I actually found very relevant. And I was making sense of them while working with these little first and second graders. Again, I have had a lot of happenstance in my life for the good.
Right. But also that awareness and that conversation and attention to the theoretical framing and the bigger ideas that undergird the analysis of the data or the research that's happening. I feel like that's a theme that I see in your work is just a real thoughtful, intense attention to the theoretical framing and what the implications are of those framings.
That is important to me. I would say back in the day, it was almost the main thing. I think that's evolved a bit, and I can't tell you how long ago, to, yeah, you want to have a very explicit about your theoretical framing. I've come to view theoretical framings as tools, and it's not, does it get the world right or that sort of thing? It's, is this a good tool for the job?
Yeah.
In other words, what we're trying to figure out, what we're trying to understand, or whatever. And so, and it's got to do practical work. What difference is it actually going to make practically? Why are we better off thinking this way?
And to me, I contrast that tool idea with truth. I came across, when I was in grad school, I came across some people that seem to carry a theory around as the truth.
That's
Like this
right.
is the true perspective on something.
Yeah.
And it never quite felt right to me. But the way you're talking about it feels more right. It feels more, how are you using it? What is it helping you to see? How is it a
I
tool in
agree,
the,
absolutely.
yeah.
And I've seen exactly the same thing. And I will be hands up. When we were our little group, the radical constructivists there at the University of Georgia, yeah, I was all in, face down in the Kool-Aid. Now, hopefully I figured that out not too long after I graduated, that it's a perspective rather than we've got the world right, how can everybody else be as dumb, which is, the height of arrogance, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
And once you realize you have a perspective, then playing around with different viewpoints and so on becomes an interesting thing to do. It's a useful exercise.
Right. So if we kind of trace that theme, in the 80s, it seemed like you had this constructivism was kind of front and center in some of the work you were doing, and you were following some of the work about young children's mathematical thinking. And so in the 80s, you were publishing on insights into young children's thinking. You were writing about the constructivist perspective and what that can help to shed light on.
Yes.
What do you remember, or what are the ideas that sort of stick with you from that era in the 80s?
That was, so you're talking about when I was beginning to work in
Kind of like when you began your faculty career.
Yeah. As I started out my faculty career, it was very much, I would say, a psychological constructivist perspective. One of the first things that happened, there was the senior person there were only two of us in math education, and my first job was at Purdue University, was a guy who was also very kind to me, Grayson Wheatley. And he pushed me a bit, and that's a very good thing for him to do, about what's this got to do with classrooms, And so we wrote a proposal together, an NSF proposal, which quite miraculously, from my point of view, was funded, which was to sort of build on this teaching experiment idea, but do it at the classroom level in collaboration with the teacher. So a healthy dose of pragmatism probably wasn't a bad thing, just what I needed at that time. And so that was the extension. And it was we were so lucky with the first teacher we worked with. And I need to say who the we is if I can later. Her name was Grace Ann Merkel. She was a second grade teacher. And there was stuff that she did on the first and second day of the school year that led to me completely changing my viewpoint. And because now we would say, there she was, God bless her, explicitly negotiating social norms with the kids. And didn't exactly understand it. This is really important if these kids are going to, learn any math worth knowing. And once you sort of look at that, then issues we would now say relating to the culture of the classroom come to the fore. So it then opens up a whole new line of work, which wasn't anticipated when we wrote the original proposal.
Wow, but that does show the preview of some of the work you did in the 1990s, where you start to really take up those social norms, the socio-mathematical norms. And to me, in the 90s, it seems like you were doing a lot of thinking about that theoretical framing, like we were talking about. But you wrote about tensions between learning theories and instruction,
Yeah.
and you compared experiential, cognitive, constructivist information processing. So to me, it's kind of like you were almost thinking through and helping the field get clarity on how these different theoretical frameworks can work in our field.
Yeah, and a lot of it, to be honest, I wrote to sort myself out as well. There's
I need to
that.
figure this out, so let's put pen to paper and let's try
Yeah,
to.
I mean, you really have to. That is a good way to think things through. I guess for me, as I think back, the big overriding thing, you're right in the things you listed, was this whole relationship or getting a handle between individual cognition, a straight ahead cognitive psychological perspective. And at that time, sociocultural theories, chat, cultural historical activity theory was very prominent. And I would be quite blunt. I used to go to the meetings and was sort of on the fringe. It's kind of a cult and was very prominent. And I saw value in both of them. That's the point. There's stuff here we can take from both. How? That's what I was trying to work out for myself. I make no claims beyond that.
Mm-hmm.
This is how I ended up thinking about it. I wasn't trying to develop a cosmology or anything grandiose like that.
Mm-hmm.
It was a way of looking at what's going on in classrooms, in math classrooms, that can help us do a better job of designing and supporting those kids learning. That's what all it was about.
So I want to get back to the socio-mathematical norms later, but along this line, what you're talking about right here. So you wrote an article in the 90s that was in the Journal for Research in Math Education that was very influential. And then you wrote one in Educational Researcher around the same time. And I think in both of those articles, you were sort of dealing with what you called out as a dualism of the math that's in the mind.
Yes.
And decades of work that had been sort of exploring math in the mind.
Yeah.
And then you're saying like, but the kids are in classrooms, they're in learning environments. The teacher is making these moves that's shaping the experiences that the students have. So maybe just say more about your thinking where you're breaking down that dualism, or you're trying to sort of blur the lines between that dualism.
Well, I mean, so you just look at kids, and yes, you understand, phases of development or developmental processes are going on between kids' ears and so on. But what does it mean for instruction? It's a huge gap from that to, so what does it imply? Not much. On the other hand, you come at it from the other side, and you use the word shaping. Yeah, profoundly influenced by, but it's not determined by. It's still a very active role for the learner. I still take a view that kids are constructing, but it's within a social context that's highly constrained. There's lots of affordances and so on. It's not just predetermined, if that makes some kind of sense. The way I used to think about it, if this is a sort of a meta analogy, suppose we do a classroom design study, and at any grade level you want. I'm going to say 8th grade for the sake of example. And we're in our classroom and there's the regular classroom next door with another, just straight ahead teaching. If we interview those kids in each classroom before and after, particularly after, I bet we could go through those videos and identify which classroom all of those kids are in, just by looking at how they responded to the video questions. You want to acknowledge that difference. On the other hand, you then look at the videos from all the kids who are in our teaching experiment classroom. Wow, there's a lot of variation there. And so that's what I'm trying to point to, or was trying to get a handle on. You understand what I'm trying to say? It's the shaping of it. The best place we ever wrote about that was with Michelle Stephan, who's a math educator at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. And it was her dissertation study where we were able to actually track 4 kids all the way through a design study, as well as look at the evolving classroom culture. It's the only time we had the resources to do that. And so you could also trace these individual kids' learning as they participated in and contributed to the development of that culture. And it's looking at those relations. It's not a one-way street from culture to kids. It's also in the classroom, the teacher and the kids are creating what is constraining them. In sociology, there's a well-known book by Anthony Giddens, and he talks about the structuring of the structures. And he's talking about large social structures. I didn't know about that at the time, but at the little micro level of the math classrooms, that's exactly what we're talking about. Mm-hmm. The folks in the classroom creating the very structures that, if you like, constrain them. It's that ongoing dualism between the duality between the two.
Mm-hmm. Before moving on from this era, I want to ask you, was there any kind of reaction that you got from other scholars? What was the reaction in the field when you were trying to work through these ideas and trying to break down some boundaries, but also trying to keep the important aspects?
I think for a lot of people, it was quite favorable, but maybe the people that I'm sure there was many that and I didn't hear from them so much.
Sample selection.
Look, if you're a purist, it wasn't going to work for you, was it? But I think some people were pleased that it wasn't a doctrinaire effort. It wasn't saying exactly what you said. This is it. I've figured it out. This is the truth. This is what, and it's like almost true believers. You're sort of member of, card-carrying member of a particular theoretical ideology. It was an open-handed perspective, which on the one, in terms of, I guess the big thing I want to get across is, for me, it's very important to justify the theoretical perspective you take. And that has to be with respect to the problem you're investigating. It's a practical decision as far as I'm concerned. And so it's no good saying, in this study, we take a socio-cultural perspective. Why? What's that going to buy you? Why are you better off doing that than any other perspective? It's that sort of approach is what I'm trying to push for.
And the response overall, though, seemed like kind of gratitude for taking that approach versus,
I don't know about
maybe there were people that were,
but I mean, I think those papers were somewhat influential. I'm sure there are some people who think it's quite, trite, rubbish, in the sense that if you have a perspective that you're wedded to, there's not a lot of room for alternative perspectives.
Well, we've already alluded to it earlier, and I do want to give some time to one of your best-known works. It's the article that you wrote with Erna Yekel about the socio-mathematical norms, and then also this notion of the emergent perspective. So I was just wondering if you just, in your own words, wanted to sort of say what that idea means to you and what you've seen as the impact of the socio-mathematical norms work on the field. And then maybe if you also want to comment a little bit about all that work you did together with Dr. Yekel. I know you had quite a bit of work. It looked like you collaborated for years together.
Lot there. It builds directly on what we were just talking about. The emergent perspective, if you put it down on a little chart, you have, on the one hand, when you look at things from a cognitive point of view, you see one thing. If you look at it from a social perspective or social interactions perspective, you see something different. And it's how do those two inform each other, those ways of looking. When I started this, back in the day, I had transcripts and I had 2 copies of the transcript, and I used to label one cognitive and I used to go backwards and forwards between the two, with what you figure out or think you understand in one actually helping you make sense out of the other one, and vice versa. So it was a very laborious business to start with. But the emergent perspective was precisely trying to get concrete about coordinating those 2 perspectives in a meaningful way. So it started out with, we talked before, classroom social norms. And it's, I think, a long time since I looked at this, but basically beliefs about what it is to do school from the kids' point of view. Then you get down to socio-mathematical norms with Erna in particular. And, then there's kids of, beliefs about mathematics, or at least mathematics as it is in school, mathematical activity, and so on. And then we had another construct, even almost at the level of, you got sort of mathematical reasoning on the cognitive side and classroom mathematical practices on the sort of social interaction side. That was what the emergent perspective was about. And it was, you can see a lot of the prior sort of theoretical ideas are implicit in it, but it's trying to develop a useful tool. And why do I think it's a useful tool? We were doing classroom design studies. And when you do a study, you analyze what goes on each day in order to figure out next steps. We wanted a framework that could help us do those analyses in a way that could meaningfully inform our ongoing design work. So the framework itself doesn't tell you how to do anything. It's the application of it in particular cases that's useful. That was a driving motive behind that framework. And the key piece of it, I think it's quite a well-known construct now, is socio-mathematical norms. And I want to say a little about how that started, because worked for many years with Erna Yeakel, and very sadly, she died last year, greatly and sorely missed. All I can tell you is, as a person, nobody ever had a better colleague. She was a deeply moral person of astonishing integrity. She was very sharp. She didn't suffer fools lightly, and she had a really strong math background to add to the mix. And yet she had formidable social skills, just remarkable in how she would interact with people and so on. And she was just a wonderful colleague. She was the one who initiated that whole line of work on social mathematical norms. She had moved up to another campus from the main campus, which was Purdue Calumet, and she worked in a school district that was 100% literally almost 100% African American students. She started there in about 88 or 89. It took her a while to establish the trusting relationship. She was the sort of person who wanted to work there because she thought she could make a difference. It was that simple. And she thought that was the place where a difference needed to be made. Very under-resourced and so on, you can imagine. And she did make a difference. And she did a design study with a second grade teacher, Mr. Willie Mack King Sr. And we mentioned Grace Ann Merkel. He also we lucked out completely, or she lucked out completely. I used to go up there one day every 3 weeks to visit. He was a remarkable man. And it's because of some of the things he did that Erna made observations that led to the development of socio-math norms. In particular, she focused in on changes at the beginning of the second grade year in how kids were justifying what they were doing. And initially, very non-mathematical sorts of justifications. We'll do it my way because I gave this, because it's my pencil we're using, this sort of thing, to that shift to mathematical. And it wasn't anything she'd intentionally worked with Mr. King on. It's just something he had influenced the kids to be doing, and she picked up on it. And so she initiated that whole line of work.
And how has it been to see it really take off in the field and become a pretty, big idea in the decades since?
I think it's gratifying. I also think it took off because it was the right idea at the right time. In other words, there were a lot of ideas floating around in the late 80s. There was Jean Lave's work. I mean, not specifically mathematical, but really drawing our attention to ideas of culture and so on. And it was within that sort of zeitgeist, if we may use it, that I think it had a receptive audience. And I think the other thing was, I think a lot of people read it. It resonated with stuff they'd seen. It hooked up with, or whatever.
Yeah, it makes sense of experiences.
Yeah, it's people, especially for people who worked in classrooms.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So speaking of classrooms, going into the 2000s here, I noticed your work, not entirely, I'm kind of just pulling out some of the main threads, but in the 2000s, you did start to do more of your work on classroom mathematical practices, kind of carrying that idea forward.
Yeah.
And then you also started to write quite explicitly about equity and about culture and how that plays into math classrooms.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could just say a little bit about how your research trajectory evolved into that 2000s there, and what was the motivation behind some of those shifts and the attention to equity.
Yeah, I tell you, they're different. So the classroom math practices, that was very intentional. It was this realization that if you talk about general classroom norms, it could be in any classroom, then socio-math norms specific to doing math, what counts as an acceptable explanation. But what about the content? The equivalent of mathematical reasoning. And for us, it was just conceptually a big gaping hole in our theoretical framework. So that was a quite intentional effort to develop that concept. But there was also a sort of practicality to it. So you do a classroom design study. This is what we were doing. And I would mention the other person in the we is Terry Wood. There were three of us. You end up with all these videos. Then what? How do you get your head around that lot conceptually? And you have to do that so you can write up about it in a way that's actually comprehensible to somebody who wasn't there. And this notion of a classroom mathematical practice was an effort to characterize analytically the collective learning of the classroom community. I would just say I think it's been very widely misinterpreted, and I've tried and tried it. I can't. It's always hopeless because I think when we get to the level of the math, everybody wants to think about it exclusively in individualistic terms. When we talk about it, we can only think about it in terms of individual kids learning. So when we talk about a learning trajectory in terms of math practices, everybody has this image of these kids moving forward in lockstep. That's not what we have in mind at all. Clearly, there's variation. Clearly, the kids are on different trajectories, but as they go through or make progress on the different trajectories, they are contributing to the evolution of those math practices. And in participating in those practices, those constrain their development and afford their development. Again, it's that two ways, it's that dualism there.
Well, and here you mean the classroom math practices that they do together with each other, right? Not just like the math practices in terms of.
Well, I mean, they create it. Yeah. They and the teacher create those math practices. And we came up, and again, I think Michelle Stefan was very much involved, Janet Bowers and others were in tightening this up methodologically. So what are the criteria for making a claim that a classroom math practice has been constituted, and so on? So you can end up with, you have this sort of stack of videotapes, and that's how it was back in the day, tape getting chewed up and whatever. And, over a period of a few weeks in a particular content domain in mathematics, and how you can sort of delineate, maybe get it down to 4 or 5 practices, and also one evolving out of the other, and so on, to get your hands around how do you talk about what happened in terms of those kids learning, and then also the diversity at any point in the ways kids are participating in those practices. So again, that's those same ideas as we talked about before, but in much more concrete form here.
So again, you're always kind of trying to balance those perspectives, and you're trying to say there's things worthwhile to look at the individual level, but there's really important things at the classroom level. And you mentioned that there's always the diversity of the individuals there. Is that part of the motivation that led to you really writing explicitly about equity and taking equity up like in a more forefront way?
I'll tell you how that happened. It had always been an interest. Now, I'm not saying that because in the current climate you're supposed to say it. It had been from way back when. But when I was doing these classroom design, I found it totally almost overwhelming to do just what I was doing, which was to focus on the kids, the mathematical learning, whatever. And what happened was about 98, 99, a new doctoral student who was going to work with me, Lynn Hodge, who's now at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, faculty member there, said she was interested in equity. Bingo, from my point of view. So I absolutely encouraged that. And it worked out in 2 ways. This is a strategy I've had throughout my career. I learn from and with my students, okay? I don't want them to end up looking like me. I want them to pursue their interests, and I learn by them working on those interests, if that makes some kind of sense. And so this was great news from my point of view. First of all, we did around that time, shifted to working at the middle school level and focusing on statistical data analysis. We did a design study. And so while I'm in the classroom focusing on the different types of arguments to kids, Lynn was in the classroom focusing very specifically on if any kids being silenced, whatever. What she was also doing was interviewing those kids periodically between class periods. And by sheer luck, the kids were also in a regular algebra classroom, so she observed those classrooms and could interview them about their experiences in the 2 classrooms and so on. From my point of view, it needed somebody to bring that extra perspective. I wasn't capable of doing it and doing the rest. So that was one aspect of it. The other thing that happened was I was up at a meeting at NSF, and somebody mentioned they had this small program where you get a very modest amount of money to write a literature review, a synthesis. And nobody ever applied for it. And so I went back and mentioned it to Lynn. I think we should try and have a go at this. And it was a tiny amount of money. It would just have supported Lynn either for a semester or a year. I can't remember. So we put it in. And you know what? It was ridiculous. NSF came back and wanted to quadruple the amount of money. They wanted us to organize two working conferences to produce a journal special issue or whatever. And this was like in 98 or something, a long time ago now. And so we brought in Carol Lee, you may know, is a language and literacy educator at Northwestern. And she's recently been, either is or just been president of, no, it must have been recently, ARA and so forth. And so she was our third PI. And we did this little project. And that was a real learning experience for me. On the one hand, a fella, white guy, no background, no track record in equity, gets all the money. It wasn't a vast amount, but nonetheless, so you can imagine people weren't happy. And I didn't blame them for not being happy. If I'd been them, I wouldn't have been happy. Mm-hmm. So from my point of view, the only thing to do was crawl on glass. So that's what I did. But we did pull off the special issue. It ended up being a double special issue of mathematical thinking and learning. Then we were approached by a publisher and we developed it into a book. And the we was Naila Nazir, who at that time was an assistant professor. She's now president of the Spencer Foundation. And we worked on those. I was the editor, first editor on the special issue, and then we flipped it so that she would be the first on the book. And that was quite intentionally done. And one thing I made lots of mistakes, but one thing I got right is the people I asked to write for that special issue, or we asked to write. And I looked around of the group, we'd had a group of about 30 people in these meetings who was actually, I thought, had interesting ideas and who was actually likely to come through. And they're all women, and they're all assistant professors at that time. It was people like Joe Bola, Sarah Lubinsky, Judith Moskovich, Naila Nazir, and so on. It was a pretty amazing group of people. We're very fortunate enough to have them right at a relatively early stage in their career. And my takeaway, so again, working on that synthesis paper with Lynn was an opportunity for me to learn and think things through and get a handle on it. And so all I'll say, give you one example. The default position in math ed on equity at that time was cultural differences. The root problem of why there's inequities is there's cultural differences between, kids who come from this sort of background and kids who come from white middle-class homes. And that's all it's about. That's how we started out. As we came to question that and to look at issues like identity and power were also important, maybe much more important than just focusing it, as we can just help these kids figure out what's going on in school, or we adjust school so it's aligned with their culture, everything's going to be fine. But it was an opportunity to work through those type of ideas. The other thing that I want to say about this, Lynn and I read these articles and we would meet and discuss them very regularly. And we not only talk about the substance of our position, but we had to talk about what it meant for us. Now, Lynn would would be classified as Asian American. She would view herself as Chinese American. It helped me realize, amongst other things, what an arbitrary set of racial and ethnic classifications we had, classification system of otherness. But what it meant for me, or the decision we both made, was it'd be very easy to prance around as white liberals polishing our own equity credentials. So at least I made the conscious decision I didn't want to do that because I wanted to do this for the right reason, which is, ultimately the kids. It's always ultimately the kids. And so I think a lot of people will be surprised to know that I've had that commitment for all these years. But what we've done, I say all the people I've worked with, is to always make sure there's an equity dimension to everything. And that's been ever since that time, so the last 25 years. It's not a separate piece. It's not an add-on. It's got to be there, integral to everything, all the work, all the way through.
Yeah.
And so that's how that came about.
I think the equity piece is very evident in the MIST project, which is something that has been ongoing for several years up to the present day, which is the middle school mathematics and the institutional setting of teaching.
Yeah.
And to me, you can say more about it, but it seems like that definitely has an equity mission behind it, and trying to think about mathematics instruction, but in schools and in schools that are under-resourced, and actually sort of making positive changes at scale
Yeah.
in ways that have not always happened or not very often happened in mathematics education in the past.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you just would tell us some of the key ideas that are underlying that MIST project and what's motivating that work.
So everything we talked about so far has been at the classroom level. And I just say two sentences about in the early 2000s, I then was involved in doing design studies with groups of teachers. In other words, we're focusing on teacher learning.
Mm.
Now to support that as a design study. One of the pioneers I always point to in that area is Marty Simon and, professional development design studies. Beyond that, as Marty put it to me one time, he said, "Why is it you jumped and do something more complicated when you haven't even figured out the easier thing yet?" Thank you, Marty. But something that bothered me for many years were two things. We do all this work at the classroom level, and yet when I go out into classrooms in my part of the world, I see next to no impact. We come up with these clever designs in statistics or early number or whatever the heck it is, and not much impact. So that was sort of one of the sort of primary motivations. The other thing that's been a belief of mine, right back from the late 80s, with stuff that happened in that very early work in Indiana, was the critical importance of linking work we do in teaching and learning with work on policy and leadership. And I tried to sell this lots of times and got nowhere. And in that work we did in the early 2000s, I tried to recruit a policy researcher. I couldn't find anybody who would be willing to get their hands dirty as opposed to do an observational study. And I got lucky at the beginning of the MIST project. The idea there was to try and ask the question, what does it take to improve the quality of math teaching on a large scale, i.e. across a large district? And I was able to recruit to the idea a guy called Tom Smith, who was policy and leadership at Vanderbilt at that time. He was an assistant professor then. He later became interim provost at one of the University of California campuses, is now back at Vanderbilt as a full professor. So we still work together somewhat. And so the idea was to bridge those two worlds with the understanding that, if you want to bring about change at the system level, you better understand the system and know that all of the parts are interdependent. So with MIST, we tried to do a design study or 4 parallel design studies at the level of large districts, where we do a large data collection each year, huge data collection. We'd analyze it. We'd give the district feedback on how their improvement efforts were working out, and we'd make specific data-driven recommendations on how they might adjust those improvement efforts or revise them or whatever to make them more effective. And so that's the design study part. And then we did this massive data collection, which we compiled over the years. And I would say what came out of that work was empirically grounded image, if you like, of what a high-functioning district looks like, and some hints at how the pieces all fit together that goes all the way from the classroom to senior district leadership.
But then to connect it up with that equity motivation that you said goes through all your work, help us set the stage to understand how the equity fits into MIST, because I know that is a big driving force of not just you, but kind of the whole team working on that.
Well, again, I've been so lucky with my colleagues, and we hired, or she came as a postdoc near the beginning of that work, was Kara Jackson, who's now, I think, quite well known at the University of Washington in Seattle, specifically because of her background and interest in working on issues of equity. And so right from the beginning, you have to make choices. And we decided our focus would be on kids whose first language was not English and on African-American students, particularly, quotes, currently struggling African-American students, and sort of highlight them when we look at what was going on in the classroom, but also follow it all the way up. So that meant we paid attention to English language learners programs, LEP programs, or whatever, collected data on what's happening in those programs, and looked at the types of support those kids were getting, as well as what the districts or the individual schools were doing to support them, and trying to explicitly analyze to what extent that was being effective or not. In addition, Kara led the development of a measure that I think is very, very important. and it's tries to basically gets at not just teachers, any practitioners' views of kids' current mathematical capabilities. Basically, trying to assess whether they believe these kids will be able to learn from and participate productively in classrooms with, quote, ambitious instruction, that sort of thing. And we found that it has very strong explanatory power. So that's sort of this broad approach we've taken. The other thing another line that Kara's initiated, and Joni Wilson, who's now at the University of Virginia, has also taken up, is analyzing what goes on in classrooms and appears to be associated with supporting African American students and English language learners in particular. And they've identified, I think, some pretty important practices as well. So again, this isn't the sort of sexy stuff of identity, but it's sort of, I think, very close to the ground, very close to practice. Mm-hmm. And for me, I see value in that type of work.
Yeah, and I'm definitely drawn to the same sort of motivation that you mentioned about wanting to make an impact, wanting to shape mathematics instruction in productive ways and ways that are more equitable to reach more students to have success in math and lift them up in their mathematical experiences. And it is frustrating, just being honest, it's frustrating to look back at decades of math education work and to not see much of the impact, like when you just go across to regular classrooms across the country. So I wonder, like, with the MIST project now, a decade in or so, like, what are some of the optimistic glimmers of hope you've seen? What are some of the challenges that you faced in terms of making the impact?
Bizarrely, I'm always optimistic. I think some of my students, people work with me, think I might be insane. It's quite possible. And I think the reason I'm optimistic, I see us making progress. I want to diverge a little, if you don't mind. Mm-hmm. So I sort of taught a course at Vanderbilt, and it's called a horrendous title, Seminal Readings in Math Education. But I learned so much from that class. It was very eye-opening to me. And I thought, God, we have made progress. How about that? And just looking at it at that level, back in the day, research on teaching and research on learning were different worlds. They didn't talk to each other. Now they do. They're much more closely integrated. Teaching is about supporting learning. Learning is supported by teaching and in classroom environments and so on. Equity, it was this fringe topic. Now I think we could argue about, is it all productive the way it's going right now? But at least it's part of the mainstream conversation. I still think there's a long way to go. But I view that these are sort of healthy developments. I think with regard to the improvement at scale, I think we're much more realistic than we used to be. It was looking for silver bullets. I mean, I found it very sobering when we started MIST to realize from the literature, pretty much in any core content area, pretty much everything had failed for the last 50 years. And so a little humility is not a bad thing if you're interested in working in this area. And it's just grinding it out and putting one foot in front of the other. And I think we did manage to take a few steps forward. Where I see the action now, this is my own personal view, is I think we've learned quite a bit about what we're aiming for. If you want to talk about the learning of schools or districts as organizations, at least what we're aiming at, and it's now grinding out how to support making progress in those sorts of directions. I must admit, I do see a lot of value in some of the ideas on improvement science from the Carnegie Foundation. I think they have to be adapted to our particular problems. We can't just take them off the shelf, but I'm quite happy to lift ideas from anywhere if I think they might be useful.
So you're getting a little bit at what I wanted to be my last substantive question, which is about the direction that you see for our field. Are there a key problem that you see that we as a scholarly community should work on going forward? And it sounds like maybe you're hinting at some of those, but I'll just give you a chance if you want to say more about that.
Okay. It was interesting on the MIST project because we didn't do much work at the classroom level because there was already a lot of stuff and the field had done a great deal. The main thing was identifying, practices for which there's evidence that they can support all kids learning, particularly kids from traditionally underserved groups. As we went up the chain, because when we do our analyses, we start with the kids, work out to the teacher, work out the supports, accountability, whatever for teach, and work our way up through the system. So it's a bottom-up approach rather than a top-down approach. As we work our way up, you don't have to get very far before you realize the research base is pretty thin. At least it's come a long way in the last 10 years, 15 years. But research on coaching, particularly content-focused coaching, was pretty desperate initially. That's come a long way. I think there's been progress on teacher collaboration or collaborative work or professional learning, whatever you want to call them. But I'm wondering to what extent there's been progress, not just on what high-functioning teacher collaborative groups look like, but how to stand up, how to create and sustain very productive groups. In other words, the further you go, there's sometimes you get an image of what it looks like, but not how to make it happen. I haven't seen people investigating that yet. So I see those as next steps. And I think figuring that out is a big part of what's involved in actually making instruction improvement on a large scale happen. I also think we have to, with regard to equity, I realize it's almost like you feel like in this current era, you take your life in your hands anytime you talk about it, which is very sad because I think it throttles debate. But I think what can be done in a feasible, pragmatic way while working at scale is absolutely essential and has to be integral to everything we do. Whether it's, if we talk about ambitious and equitable instruction, well, where's the equity in it? Yeah, I think ambitious instruction is probably a lot more equitable than the regular stuff, but it's still falls way short, if you know what I mean. But it's to do it in an empirically grounded way. Mm-hmm. The same with, we could go all the way up the line.
Mm-hmm. I've been having conversations for years about equity in mathematics education, and there's the argument made that mathematics education as it currently is constituted, at least in the United States, can be very harmful to certain groups of students.
Yeah.
And I completely buy that argument. I do think it is harmful, and it has marginalized groups of students for a long time.
Can I share one misfinding?
Sure.
Oh God, is it harmful? We worked about 30 schools in the first part of MIST. Every one of those schools had second math classes or some supplemental support. And we all know why, right? To get kids over the line on state tests. You go into those classrooms and it's horrendous. A student of Tom Smith's, Rebecca Schmidt, did a formal quantitative analysis to see if there was any benefits using value-added stuff, and found that by and large, they were not effective, but sometimes they were harmful. But just you go in there, and if you were to design a program to make kids hate math, this would be it. And even in some schools, kids were taking 3 math classes.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, the tragedy of it is these are well-intentioned people doing this.
Yeah.
So, in other words, the system's really screwed up.
Right. And it's disproportional about which students might get placed into
Absolutely.
those tracks. And that
Absolutely.
Sort of yeah. And so for me, I buy all that. I buy, and people talk about the immediate transformation that needs to happen to mathematics education to stop this harm. But I've been trying to write about this recently with Xandra D'Arajo and Amber Candela, and we've been writing about how we agree that there's a need for an immediate transformation, but we feel like a lot of the equity work is focused on the transformation part.
Yeah.
Like what needs to transform, how it needs to revolutionize to other ways of thinking about mathematics or teaching it. But we feel like also people need to focus on the immediate part. Like what can we do immediately to relieve some of the harm or make things a little bit better? We need something immediate while we also try to figure out the transformational part, because it doesn't seem like the transformation part can happen right away. Like there's no quick fix to it.
And it's also a lot of writing about what needs to happen, or there's a lot of, and everybody needs to try harder and pull their socks up type sort of approach. That's not going to do it. I think there's great value in understanding the system that's creating this. This isn't happening by chance. It's a systemic problem. It's not just because everybody in the schools are rotten people. It's because of the way systems are set up. Some of that's within our control. A lot of it isn't. State level policies and so forth. Mm-hmm. But if we can't this is adage from the Carnegie Foundation. Schools are producing exactly the results they were designed to produce right now. It's not happening by chance, including the inequities and so on. How are those getting produced? And then what's the alternative design? How's that going to get implemented? What are the capabilities people have to develop within that system? What tools and resources do they need? So it's getting pretty nuts and bolts-ish.
Yeah.
So I think unless we operate at that pretty boring level, we're not going to get anywhere.
Well, the conversation has not been boring. My guest is Paul Cobb, one of the most cited scholars in mathematics education. It's been really great talking to you about the just really a portion of your career. I know we could talk for a lot longer, and I know listeners probably have more questions they'd love to hear from you, but I want to finish with just my trusty final question. We've just covered a lot of ups and downs and different ideas in your career. But what if you hadn't done any of that? What if you were not in math education? What if you hadn't taken that plane ride over to Georgia?
Yeah.
Could you imagine that you did something else with your life?
I tell you, on the one hand, boy, I was so lucky. I'm a lucky man to blunder into math education research. It was a perfect fit. And the big thing about it, I've loved every moment, is learning and working with great people and learning with great people. One thing I do love is travel. I always have, right from when I was a kid. I did a lap in North America on the buses on my own when I was 18, around Canada and the US and so on. First time I came to this country. And I enjoy planning trips. We travel independently, and I'd like to do all the research. And if I was not a math educator, God forbid, it would be a travel writer, I think, because it's very similar in a way. There's a lot of research and study, and there's experiential aspects to it, and so on. So that's the best I can say.
Yeah, and still get some writing, get to bring to life experiences. And
that's right. Yeah.
Well, that's so great. Paul, thanks so much for spending the time with us and sharing some of your ideas.
Pleasure. Appreciate it. I appreciate the thought you put into these questions. Thank you.